Hello everyone. Today we're going to be talking about pedigrees. So pedigrees is an additional sort of subject that I've often included in this sort of separate handout for the genetics unit, and maybe one day I'll finally get it in. But a pedigree is the genetics and particularly the phenotypes of individuals within a family. And pedigree to establish modes of inheritance. It can also be used to simply predict whether a family has an existing condition that we should be concerned about, and other ideas like that. It is a basic method for determining, so there's a basic method for determining the pattern of inheritance of any trait. So all these traits that we've been looking at so far, and we said, oh yeah, this is a dominant trait, and this is a recessive trait, this is an epistatic trait. All of that came from essentially doing pedigrees, and something like 23andMe is doing this on a massive scale, right? They are looking at the genetics and they're comparing those genetics to the traits, and that's why these genetic testing programs often come with long drawn out interview processes to establish a person's genetic history. All right, so once the family history is determined, the doctors will draw up information in the form of a specialized chart called a pedigree that uses particular sets of standardized symbols. You can see the standardized symbols up here. In this standardized symbol, we always establish that males are the squares and females are the circle, thinking about those in the genetically important sense as the sperm and egg donors. If the sex is unknown, then that will be given a sideways diamond. And then those that are affected with a condition have a filled in square, and those that are carriers for a condition will have the half-filled square. And sometimes you'll even see the use of a dot for carriers when it is an X-linked carrier. So that dot there kind of makes it look like an egg cell. That's because only the females can be X-linked carriers anyways. And then we see some other important factors here. We see the coupling and offspring. So couples have arrows dropped between them, or have a line connecting them horizontally, and offspring have a vertical line that comes down from between a couple. If they are direct parents. If they're adopted, then dotted lines will come in, but those are not connected by a solid line because we are looking for genetic carriers. And we can see some other more rare examples here as well. Okay, so the offspring are connected to each other by a horizontal line above the symbols, and to the parents by vertical lines. So these are the most important aspects. We also tend to use Roman numerals to symbolize generations, with the most recent generation at the bottom, and Arabic numerals to symbolize the birth order. So here we can see generation 1 had a female child, then a male child, and then another female child, and then another male child. I guess we should actually think about these as males, as in as people. I guess they're not siblings or anything. These have been shown to be deceased. That's what these lines here are for. And these are couples, right? So this is a grandparent, grandma, or great grandma, great grandpa, great grandma, great grandpa. These great grandmas and great grandpas had children. So here, this family only had one child. And they were the firstborn child in this organization for this generation, and it was a female child who was born first. If there are multiple children of this, we'll only see that over here. We'll see the multiple children. So this female child ended up becoming the mate of this male child here, number 4, and this male child is the youngest of 2 children. And here's the 2 children, a female and a male. And then there's a new male who is a little bit older than his partner. So a new male number 2 from generation 2, who was a male partner to number 3. and they together had a child, number 7, of the 3rd generation. And also in the 3rd generation are all of these other children. You can see that that 1 and 4 were very prolific with their children. They had 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 children, all connected by this section of arrows. And all of these children are in the same generation as this other couple. And all of those children had their own partners who they had children with. And we can see the 4th generation, the great grandchildren are all labeled down here, and they've been arranged in order of their birth order. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Then the cousin over here, 6, 7, and 8. Okay, so that's sort of the idea. We can now use these as together. So 2, 3 would be generation 2. Number 3, we'll be talking about that individual there. Okay, so that's sort of how this chart can be useful. And the more useful thing is when we start to track genetic traits. So using general genetic principles, the information presented in a pedigree can be analyzed to determine whether a given physical trait is inherited or not and what the pattern of inheritance is. In Mendelian patterns, the traits can be either dominant or recessive. And that's what we're going to focus on in this chapter, I suppose. Now, if you're familiar with the show Game of Thrones, there was a very important plot point in the very first season about how the main character, I forget his name, played by Sean Bean or whatever, he went around and he found information on all of the king's offspring, as the illegitimate offspring, found information about them and developed and compared that to the pedigree of that king, and found that all of his offspring had dark hair, all of his parents and himself had dark hair. And so when he compared that pedigree with his own children who had blonde hair, he said, wait a second, how does the king have blonde-haired children? And that was one of the reasons that people started to work against Sean Bean's character, who I cannot... Robert Baratheon? I don't know. No, that was the king. Anyways, so pedigrees are a plot point we see in some other pieces of culture as well. Okay, so here is how the pattern will show up if the trait that we are discussing is a dominant trait. So here we're looking at a feature. So perhaps we're looking at dark hair, for example. And so any individual who has the trait that we're interested in has been shaded into to sort of make them show up on the trait. So here we see an idealist pedigree of a family with hypercholesterolemia, an autosomal dominant disease where the heterozygote has a reduced number of functional low-density lipoprotein receptors. And so we can see that this dominant trait we're interested in, particularly interested in, the heterozygotes who will have this trait, have a reduced number of functional disease. Okay, I don't know if that has anything helpful to do at all, but here we have a dominant trait, and we can see the trait appearing in individual number 1, individual number 2, number 1 of the first generation, 1 of the second generation, 5 of the second generation, 8 of the second generation, and we can see that if a family does not carry that trait, then none of their children will carry that trait. And that's how we know that it's autosomal dominant, because if it was autosomal recessive, then we could have individuals who did not have the trait who still had children who had the trait. So in this way, this person up here is either a homozygous or heterozygous individual. So let's call this, what is this thing called? Hypercholesterolemia. So this person is probably a heterozygote like this, and anybody who does not have the trait must be a homozygous recessive because it's a dominant trait. So here we can see that together they could have children like numbers 3 and 6 who are homozygous recessive, because if we did our cross, we would see that this blue individual and number 1 and this one number 1, here we go, and we would see that 50 of their children could be the homozygous recessive, which are the unaffected, and whereas 50% of them could be the affected as well. So here's an affected, and then we get again, now here's our 50-50 chance. Here's 50% of the children who are not affected, 50% who are affected, and meanwhile, the two individuals in the second generation who do not carry the disease, they do not have any children who have any children with the disease because they are all free of it. Right? Okay. And so this is the dominant pattern. So in the dominant pattern, we're going to see that the trait can spread from one parent having the trait to the next generation, and it will almost always spread from one parent to the next. And if the two parents are not affected, then 100% of their children will be unaffected as well. So maybe we're going to give you, and so you can see these are the characteristics of this trait. So every affected individual has at least one affected parent. Affected individual, one affected parent. The affected individual who mates with an unaffected individual has a 50% chance of transmission, and two affected individuals may have unaffected children. And if you are, and this first one also, maybe I'll type it here, but if the requirement is that every affected individual has at least one affected parent, then therefore all unaffected couples have only unaffected children. So there's another criteria you can use. So if you are looking at a pedigree and it fits these three qualities, then we could say that it is a dominant trait that we're measuring. So let's look at the recessive pattern, which is maybe even more common because recessive patterns are, a little bit more. There are more diseases that are in the recessive condition. So recessive traits are passed on to children from both parents, although the parents may seem perfectly normal or the unaffected phenotype. These characteristics for recessive pedigrees are that one, an individual who is affected may have parents who are not affected. So let's look for an example of that right here. So here's number one. Here's an affected child, and they have two parents who are unaffected. All children of two affected individuals are affected. We don't have that example here, but we could imagine that if we drew a line to an affected parent, then we would expect that all of the children, doesn't matter if they're circles or squares, would be affected. And the reason this is that this is a recessive genotype, so 100% of their children must be the recessive genotype. Over here, we have what we call a carrier. These are unaffected parents who have an affected child, so that means that they must be carriers for whatever this disease is, so that they can have that pedigree, or they can have that cross. I'm trying to draw a square. Let me try one more time. We want to be able to have a cross where we have the heterozygote cross with that recessive child. That is this one right here. And we don't actually know the genotypes of this person, but when we see that there is an affected child here, this also goes back and identifies this child from generation 2 as a carrier, because only a carrier and an affected can have, or a carrier and a carrier can have children with that disease. Also, if a parent has the disease, that means that all of their unaffected children are also carriers. So these are all sort of fun things that we can figure out as we go along. In pedigrees involving rare traits, the unaffected parents of an infected individual may be related to each other. So this is another category of recessive patterns, is that sometimes they are very rare traits and they will travel through families. The reason for the two distinct patterns of inheritance has to do with the genes that predispose an individual to a given disease, and this is just simply review. There are different forms known as alleles, and they are homozygous or heterozygous, dominant and recessive. Okay, so the next pattern is the X-linked pattern. So in the X-linked pattern, we can look for 3 clues: that there's going to be a greater presence in male offspring, that males with the disease always have male offspring without the disease, since the X is not passed from male to male, and females are if the this is if the female is not a carrier. Is not a carrier. Yeah, or we should just say may have male offspring without the disease, and female offspring only have the disease if their male parent also has the disease. So let's look here. We can see a female here who is a carrier, who has a disease. So that if they have the disease and it's an X-linked recessive, then that means that they must have the recessive, homozygous recessive genotype. We don't know what the male genotype is in this example. Actually, we do, because males have only one X chromosome. If they're normal, they must have the normal genotype. So we can actually apply that to any male that's normal, is that they must be the carrier for the normal gene, or the unaffected versus the affected, right? And so here we can see that because they have a mother, because number 5 in generation 2 has a mother who has the disease, they must be inheriting that X chromosome from that mother. Same thing with this male child, also inheriting that disease. Here, the daughter is inheriting the disease, but her father has the normal chromosome, or the unaffected chromosome, so she is a carrier. And that's where we can use that dot to symbolize a carrier. So here is the X carrier, because one parent, the male parent, carries the healthy chromosome, and the female parent carries or has only the affected chromosomes. Notice here it's another recessive trait. So when a recessive trait is when both are affected with a recessive trait, then all of their children, doesn't matter if they're male or female, are going to inherit that trait. Okay, over here we have a female who is a carrier, and that female carrier can have male children who are affected, but because the male father is unaffected, we know that we actually don't know what the other chromosome is for these daughters. We are going to leave what's a little blank spot with an underline, because we don't actually know that one. They might inherit a dominant gene from their mom, or they might inherit the recessive gene. We won't know until those daughters go on to have their own children and watching the pattern of inheritance for them. We do know that this son who does not have the trait must have the dominant gene, because that is the unaffected gene. Okay, so what follows are some questions. I would recommend you pause the video and try some of these questions at this point. I'm going to do the first few pages, and then I'll fill in the rest at a different time, or I might assign the rest as homework actually. So here we have a condition that's recessive. So they're actually telling you. So black is homozygous recessive. We're not even going to tell you what disease it is. So we're just going to straight up say this is a recessive trait. So let's just give all of these the recessive condition. And now, can we figure out anything else about any of the other individuals? Well, for example, what are the genotypes of the first generation? Well, if they have one child that has the recessive, we're assuming autosomal recessive, so autosomal. If they have one child who has the condition, then that means that these can actually become half-shaded squares because that child inherited those recessive genes from their carrier parents. So here these would both be carrier parents. And this does imply something about these other two children, but not that much. We don't know what the other gene is for this person because we only know that they have the normal condition. So if they have the normal condition, they must have at least one of the dominant normal genes. Here that applies to all of these. So that's always a fun way to do it. If you know it's a recessive condition, you can just go through and identify every normal individual with one chromosome. Same thing, all of the recessive individual, all the affected individuals with the other chromosome. And then look at their children. So in this case, we have some children with the affected disease. They must have got those Bs, those recessive genes, from their parents. And so here, this is a B from this parent, and that's the B from that parent. And same thing for generation 3 as well. Now, we actually don't know anything about number 4 in generation 3, but we do know that this mother can only donate little b's to all of her children. So they are all going to be carriers. And we should probably go in and fix their squares with that half-filled notation. Okay, and then like that. So we might be able to make a guess that generation 3 individual 4 is probably homozygous dominant, but because they don't have any affected children, but we can't know that until we do further testing. Okay, and you can see above the answers for that question. Okay, for this question, the widow's peak is a dominant trait and the continuous hairline is recessive. So they have identified the continuous hairline with the dark square. So that's the trait that they're identifying with the dark hair. So we're going to just play it straight that way. So let's go with, it was widow's peak, so widow's peak is the dominant condition. So that means that all of the parents, all of these white squares are all the dominant condition. They all carry that widow's peak gene, but some of them are going to be carriers and some of them will be recessive, homozygotes. Whether we'll be able to figure that out is going to be, so let's see. So this individual here has this first generation, they get together and they have 3 children. One of those children is afflicted with the continuous hairline. So that means that both parents must be carriers for that allele. This person here, number 3, does not have any children, so we're going to leave a blank spot there. Please indicate your blanks with an underline or with a low tab. And then actually we don't have to indicate that because one of their parents has the recessive condition. So actually we know that all of these children have to carry one of their father's continuous hairline genes, or continuous hairline gene. So now we have a continuous hairline mother crossing with a widow's peak father, and all of their children have the widow's peak condition, and all of them are going to be carriers for that continuous hairline because they have a parent who has a continuous hairline. Over here we have another continuous hairline person. Both of these are continuous hairline individuals. They are crossed and they're crossing here, so all of their children must be carriers. And if you'd like, it'd be even better to go in and indicate the carrierness by half shading. all of these circles. So it's going to be a very half-shaded circle. Here we have a homozygous recessive individual child, generation 3-5, and that means that both of their parents must at least have one gene of the continuous hairline, and all of these are, there's a lot of carriers here, so there's a real high chance of continuous hairline in the next generations to follow. Okay, and there we go. There we go, and all of it's their fault. There we go. Okay. Let's look at this one and consider carefully here. Let's see if we could make the assumption, let's say that they are tracking long lashes this time. So in this case, they're going to track the long lashes. And what would that do to this? So what if the square here, right? What if this equals the dominant condition? And when you don't know, when we're building these pedigrees, often we're investigating something we don't actually know anything about yet, right? So we might not know before we do this experiment that long lashes are dominant over short lashes. We only know that these people who have the dark squares, they have these eyelashes. And then when we look at the patterns that show up, how could this inform us that this is a dominant or a recessive trait? And so we see the long lash person crossing with a short lash person, and they have a child with short lashes. Later on, we figure out that this person has the recessive genotype, and that person has the recessive genotype, and this is the dominant genotype, or by the heterozygote, but they express the trait, which is why we've shaded in the square. So now, when it's a dominant trait, a dominant pattern of inheritance, it becomes, because we're looking at the dominant trait, the pedigree kind of becomes less useful, because it doesn't really properly show us the carriers anymore. So here we can see another case where there must be a carrier. We can interpret that backwards, at least, from the results. And then this individual, all of these have long lashes, but they also have the must be carriers because their parent had the short lashes. And then if we have short lashes, we can fill that out. So this will be dependent on the type of information they give you. I think that all three of these questions that we've covered today in this video here, they all need to actually be a little bit fixed, and we should really have them indicate that the individuals with condition blah are the shaded in squares. On the next one, you'll see possibly the most fun question that you can have, which is the carrier question for the X-linked hemophilia. And in this example, they actually have plotted out the real information on hemophilia for the royal family. And you can actually see Prince William and Harry down here, who I guess we actually should expand that chart with their own children. But in this case, we have hemophilia throughout the royal families of Europe, and we can see that we have some known conditions, like we know that Queen Victoria II was a carrier for hemophilia. And so this tells us something about Victoria and Edward, since we have identified here the hemophiliacs by the shaded squares. We can work backwards and figure out, well, if Edward was not a hemophiliac, then where did Victoria's X hemophilia gene come from? Well, it must have come from her mother. And so we can half shade her mother. Although we did learn just a second ago that this actually should be a dot. So let's try the dot, because that's what we should actually be doing, is a circle with a dot. All right, so Victoria has a bunch of children, and there's a possibility that any of her that we know that only Leopold showed hemophiliac disorder, but we also know that some of her children might be carriers. For example, we don't know anything about Helena because she didn't have any children. But when we look at Beatrice's family, as we go down her family tree, we notice that there are some hemophiliac sons. Well, those hemophiliac sons must have got it from their mother. And if they got it from their mother must have got it from, carried it over from her mother, and her mother carried it from Victoria. Over here we have Leopold. Leopold had an X chromosome with the hemophiliac condition. And then he donated that to his children, but not to his sons. So these ones are clear. They're fine. But this one daughter here may have had would have inherited his hemophiliac chromosome, no matter what. And then when she had children, she had a hemophiliac son. And this is the exact same hemophilia gene as Leopold had. Okay, let's move around over here. So here we see another son with the hemophiliac condition. So that also would be that same hemophiliac gene that Victoria carried. And this is also a really fun example that we can bring back to the idea of evolution, right? Look at how this one allele has spread through a whole family all over the place here, right? It's spread through the whole family, and yet this was not a favorable gene. This is not a gene that's helping them succeed. It's just a gene that is that just doesn't have a huge impact on their success, and especially because these are rich, rich people in the rich elites. They can survive with proper family care and all that. And so this is, it's sort of interesting that, thinking about what if this had been a mutant gene, right? If it had been a mutation, a gene mutation, it would have equally spread through a whole family. And so one individual with coupling once has produced, say, in, let's say, the third generation. By the third generation, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 people are carrying that gene. By the fourth generation, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 6 of the males of that generation are all carrying that same hemophilia chromosome that was the result of Victoria. So if this has been an actual genetic mutation, then we could actually think about how we went from, if this had been one mutation in Victoria, in 1, 2, 3, 4 generations, it went from being carried by a single individual to being carried by 6 individuals. That's a 6-fold increase in the spread of that one gene. So it's not impossible to think about how other genes can spread through population, especially if they improve the fitness of the individual. All right, anyways, that's enough for today, and hope you enjoyed that. I will leave you to work on the remainder of this pedigree activity. You'll probably have to do these on your own. One of them is a very fun Muggle or Magic wizarding one, and I will possibly split this off and post it separately so that you can do it on your own time. Anyways, have a great day, and we'll talk to you soon.